Hello, friends. This is going to be continuing our journey towards a deep dive of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. But I realized as I was prepping the episodes for that we can't just jump right to The Wrath of Khan. Well, we could, but we're going to miss out on a lot of reasons why some decisions were made, origins of characters, different things like that. So in order to understand and explore that, we need to journey from Space Seed all the way up to production of The Wrath of Khan. So in this episode, we're going to be heading back, way back, to the before time, to the long, long ago. And we're going back all the way to 1967 to Space Seed. And then we're going to journey forward. And I don't know how far we're going to get. And I honestly, at this point, since I'm recording it right now, don't know how long this episode's going to be. It could be very, very short, or it could be another whopper. We'll find out together. All right. Release all moorings. Here we go. 5, 4, 3. Hands on keys. Turn. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epic of belief. It was the epic of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. Greetings and felicitations. This is Michael Haspel, and welcome to Quantum Froth Dispatches, where we're going to head back to the saga of Star Trek and its journey all the way to Star Trek II, which is, of course, following our theme of 1982 films that are now considered classics and that were pivotal to filmmaking and to pop culture in general, all the way up till today. And we're going to begin with, we left off in last episode with the end of Space Seed, and our theory that maybe James Kirk covered up the entire Khan Noonien Singh incident and Botany Bay and everything, and leaving them on City Alpha 5. So this episode is not going to concentrate so much on Trek lore in somewhat story events, but real world stuff like Star Trek history. And in researching this, I came up with a lot of facts that some of them I knew from before, and some of them I did not know, and I discovered them much to my surprise and enjoyment, because I love doing these deep dives. So I hope that I can bring you a lot of information that some of you may not be aware of. And we're going to start with what I would call like trouble in paradise. We know that Star Trek from its inception was a troubled production. It was always over budget. It was always running late. Desilu was frankly bleeding money making this show, and the ratings weren't what NBC would have liked. They were pretty low. But there was also some other strife. We get the idea that maybe the whole Star Trek family, everybody got along. We got hints of later on, in the late 80s, early 90s, there were, as the original cast started writing memoirs and stuff like that, we started getting hints that maybe everything wasn't as hunky-dory on the set as we were led to believe, But, Star Trek is just like any other production. And if I were to tell you that, the word of the day, of course, nowadays is toxic. Everything's toxic, a toxic fan base because you don't like, a Star Wars movie that you feel disrespected characters or, maybe a subpar offering in a franchise or something. The word they go to is toxic. This is not a new phenomenon. We will tell stories of some ugly fans. We will tell stories of really troubled productions, of producers, of creators being kicked off their own creation. All kinds of things that may sound contemporary, especially when you consider, say, right now, the sort of troubled Star Wars productions with episodes 8 and 9. But these things are not new. These have been going on for a long time. And to kind of just like punctuate that, in season 1 of Star Trek, Spock was way more popular than they thought that he would be. So there were some problems going on where he got the lion's share of fan mail, and he would just get sacks and sacks of it every day. And so NBC was just like, hey, we need to give this guy a raise. And his agent was pushing for it too. Desilu was losing money on the show, so they really couldn't do it. And they actually considered getting rid of Spock for season 2, because there was a lot of strife between him and William Shatner, where who would get to share the limelight and everything like that. And what's interesting is that NBC, and if you'll recall in our last thing, we were talking about how they made the pilot The Cage, and there were 2 characters on there that NBC did not like. They did not like number 1, which was Majel Barrett, played by Majel Barrett, that was the first officer of the Enterprise under Captain Pike, and the science officer, Mr. Spock. They thought he was like a bit satanic. They didn't care for either one of those characters, and they wanted to get rid of him. Gene fought and was able to keep Spock. And what is kind of funny about this is that when they were just like, hey, we're losing money, and the board of directors at Desilu was already thinking about canceling the show, even if NBC wanted to continue, because it was frankly bankrupting the studio. So the ones that broke the stalemate on what to do was actually NBC, and they said, you are not doing the show without that guy. Pay him whatever you need to pay him. So there was enough strife between William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy that Gene Roddenberry had to write a letter, like a memo to both of them saying, you need to knock it off. And I have a quote from the letter here. It's like, and I'm not going to read the entire thing. And incidentally, if you do want to investigate some of this oral history stuff that I'm talking about, there's a fantastic book by Edward Gross and Mark A. Altman called The 50-Year Mission, the first 25 years, the complete, uncensored, unauthorized oral history of Star Trek. And I'm going to be referring to this several times, but that's where I'm getting some of these juicy tidbits from, and it's actually really cool. So this is Gene Roddenberry in a letter to William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, and actually DeForest Kelley too, just tossed in there. And he goes, because what was going on is they would swap the best lines. Like Shatner would go, "Oh, that's a really good line," and Kirk should say that, or and so they were arguing for lines. So he goes, and this is talking about to Shatner. He's like, I want you to realize fully where your fight for absolute screen dominance is taking you. It's already affecting the image of Captain Kirk on the screen. We're heading for an arrogant, loud, half-assed Queeg character who is so blatantly insecure upon that screen that he can't offer to let anyone else have an idea, give an order, or solve a problem. You can't hide things like that from the audience. And then he chastises Leonard Nimoy. And now, Leonard, I must say that if I was Shatner, I'd be nervous and edgy about you by now, too. For a man who makes no secret of his own sensitivity, you show a strange lack of understanding of it in your fellow actors. So he gives them this rebuke. They decide they're going to keep Spock in season 2. But what's interesting is we get the formation here going into season 2 of really what I've been calling kind of the Star Trek triangle or the Star Trek triumvirate, because in season 2, DeForest Kelley gets his name as top billing in the opening credits, along with Shatner and Nimoy, kind of acknowledging that McCoy is that third part of the triangle. And also, we get there's a lot of grief that Shatner gets for his style of acting, and what a lot of people forget is that Shatner was a stage actor, and he was kind of overdoing everything, larger than life, because he had been giving a performance, and when he delivered the lines like that, nobody was bored, and which is a good thing. So he just kept kind of doing it. And a lot of people, that's become a running joke about Shatner and his pauses and commas, and people overdo it. But Nimoy actually had some positive things to say about this. So he's like, during the series, we had a failure. I experienced it as a failure in an episode called The Galileo 7. The Spock character had been so successful that somebody said, let's do a show where Spock takes command of a vessel. So we had this shuttlecraft mission where Spock was in charge. I really appreciated the loss of the Kirk character for me to play against. The Bill Shatner Kirk performance was the energetic, driving performance, and Spock kind of slipstream him along and offer advice, give another point of view, and put into the position of being the driving force, the central character, was very tough for me. So that's from Leonard Nimoy. And the reason I started with that quote from A Tale of Two Cities was because there are a lot of ups and downs that we're going to be talking about. And of course, when we get to Star Trek II, that quote, albeit not the full quote, and I still didn't read the full thing, but the opening line of A Tale of Two Cities plays a prominent role in Spock's giving a copy of that book to Kirk for his birthday. So, and there's a lot more parallels with A Tale of Two Cities as well that we'll get into when we finally talk about the film and start doing a deep dive of that. But this is one of those low points coming. And kicking off, season 2, Desilu effectively went bankrupt, and Paramount bought them out. So Lucille Ball, who had saved Star Trek, who had greenlit Mission Impossible, who we owe so much to, she lost her own studio. And it was primarily due to Star Trek. They kind of gambled on the show, and it didn't work out as they were hoping. And unfortunately, she had to sell Desilu to Paramount Pictures, and that was all that was left of her marriage at that point. So it's really tragic, and she sacrificed all that for Star Trek. So we owe her even more. And the irony of it going down like that is her instincts were good. You know what I mean? She believed in Star Trek, and she thought it was going to be one of the biggest shows in syndication ever. But the problem is that they were going at least $15,000 over budget an episode. Now, in 1968 dollars, that's about $500,000. And when you think about episodes, being produced today, that's really expensive. If a show was overrunning $500,000 an episode, there's no way it would stay on the air. But the real tragedy of the thing is that about 6 months later, they had enough episodes to start putting it out in syndication. And so by the end of the second season, they had enough episodes. Star Trek started playing in syndication, and it was in 60 different countries. And of course, then money starts rolling in. All these advertising and everything starts rolling in. But it was too late for Desilu. And Paramount had now taken control. Another dark kind of like down thing that happens is that Gene kind of gets kicked off his own show. And I'm jumping the gun a little bit here because we get to the end of season 2. And this is when that happens. But I need to talk about something else that happened first. And just give me 1 second here while I grab these notes because they're out of order. And what we get is in season 2, we got an episode called Assignment Earth that took place in 1968. Now, it is kind of a weird episode. You'll see that Robert Lansing, who is a guest star on that episode, actually gets front billing in the opening credits, along with William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, and DeForest Kelley, which is really odd. It's really strange. That doesn't really happen. The story is also strange. It's one of these few stories where you get the Enterprise talking about time travel as if it's a routine thing. It begins with Kirk narrating his captain's log, and he's just, hey, this is, we are on a routine assignment heading back for historical observation to understand why Earth did not get into a nuclear war. And they wind up they go back in time. Well, they start off, they're actually back in time. And they also say some weird things like we're using the deflector screens to avoid detection. So it's not quite a cloaking device, but I'm guessing that they're using it in some way to reflect radar rays or whatever technology could detect the Enterprise in 1968. It's just kind of a throwaway hand-waving line that, oh, hey, they can't see us because we're using deflector shields or whatever. So the show principally centers around a human guy named Gary Seven, who is from Earth but has been living on an alien planet, and these aliens have sent him to 1968 to undertake this mission to keep kind of benevolent interference, and there's a lot of notable things in it. One of the things that I kind of find funny is that when they have Gary Seven in the brig, he's able to get out and knocks a guard out or something, and he has this thing in his hand that he refers to as a servo. And people who are very fond of a different fandom would probably easily recognize that device as a sonic screwdriver. And there are a lot of parallels between Doctor Who and this Assignment Earth. And Doctor Who, of course, had been on the air for at least 5 years at this point. I think it came out in 1963. So it's a curious thing. But the idea behind this was that it was a pilot. It was a soft pilot for a show. And Gary Seven was going to be a recurring character that went on different missions, kind of interfering with Earth history on the behalf of aliens, but in a good way. So kind of like Doctor Who meets Quantum Leap meets Star Trek. And the show did not get picked up because Star Trek was going to get canceled. And a very famous fan, and I'm probably going to butcher her name. Her name is Jo Trimble, but it's spelled like BJO, and I don't know exactly how to pronounce that. She started a letter writing campaign to save Star Trek, and it was one of these first letter writing campaigns, and NBC was absolutely inundated. So they were used to getting, 1,000 letters a week of fan mail or something like that. They received millions. And then they started getting fan mail from people they weren't expecting. They famously, from Isaac Asimov and Martin Luther King. They were original Star Trek fans, and they started getting letters from scientists and engineers and people all over the place that they were not expecting. And so they decided to greenlight a third season of Star Trek, albeit with a much curtailed budget and some creative problems. So they were just like, hey, you're not shooting as much on location. We're going to have a lot of bottle shows. They need to save money. And then they gave marching orders. And this is not going to be the last time you're going to hear this. This is a running theme with Star Trek. They gave marching orders that it had to appeal to a wider audience. And it couldn't just be to the hardcore science fiction crowd. I believe those were J.J. Abrams' marching orders also, which is why he made a film that was largely based on pulp culture references of Star Trek rather than actual story. But I promised I wasn't going to talk about JJ, so I'm going to move on. So one of the dark things that happens here is that Gene Roddenberry had kind of been battling back and forth with the studio about this. Oh, yeah. One more thing before I get into this. The Assignment Earth episode actually figures in a really, really young Terry Garr as like the secretary that works for Gary Seven. And it's actually really cool. And then Assignment Earth wound up getting resurrected as the Questor tapes, which was another Gene Roddenberry production. And Gary Seven has shown up again and again in comic books and in a couple of the novels too. So I didn't want to, I just saw that on the notes and I was like, oh yeah, Terry Garr was that, it's actually really funny because Jean kept messing with her costume. He wanted her skirt to be shorter and shorter and shorter, and they kept redoing the hem of the skirt. So to jump back to where we're starting season 3, NBC kind of pulled like a little switcheroo fast one. They were just like, oh, hey, I'll let Gene Roddenberry say it. So this is Gene. I told NBC that if they would put us on the air as they were promising on a weeknight at a decent time slot, 7:30 or 8 o'clock, I would commit myself to produce Star Trek for the 3rd year. Personally, produce the show as I had done at the beginning. About 10 days or 2 weeks later, I received a phone call at breakfast, and the network executive said, "Hello, Gene, baby." I knew I was in trouble right then. He said, "We have had a group of statistical experts researching your audience, and we don't want you on a weeknight in an early time. We have picked the best youth spot that there is. All our research confirms this, and it's great for the kids, and that time is 10 o'clock on Friday nights." I said, "No doubt this is why you have the great kiddie show, The Bell Telephone Hour, on there last year." As a result, the only gun I then had was to stand by my original commitment that I would not personally produce the show unless they returned us to the weeknight time they promised. So NBC calls Gene's bluff, and Gene is now off the show. And incidentally, that like Friday night time slot is kind of the kiss of death. Fox did it to Space Above and Beyond, and I believe to Firefly. I don't remember, but I know they did it to Space Above and Beyond because they kept moving things around, so you couldn't even actually watch the show. And the only show that I can think of on Fox that really prospered during that time, and this is, of course, before DVRs and before all that stuff, was The X-Files. The X-Files did pretty well on that, and it got so popular that they wound up moving it to Sunday nights. So the more mainstream audience could watch it. Because, of course, on Friday nights, everyone's doing something. So another producer was brought in. His name is Fred Freiberger, and he created a bunch of the episodes. Now, there are some rumors and everything that season 3 of the original series Star Trek doesn't live up to the rest of the show. That season 3 was kind of the worst season. And I would kind of agree with that, but there are some fantastic gems, and it's not like season 1 and 2 didn't have some dog episodes. They did. And there were some good episodes in season 3. Now, here's like Fred Freiberger says, Our problem was to broaden the viewer base, to do a science fiction show, but get enough additional viewers to keep the series on the air. So I tried to do stories that had a more conventional storyline within the science fiction frame. And it kind of shows. A lot of the stories, but some of these are my favorite episodes. They're among my favorites. Spectre of the Gun is this kind of really surrealistic Western with minimal sets. It's a great science fiction story, but it's also at its core a Western where the crew of the Enterprise, they find themselves in Tombstone right before the confrontation at the OK Corral. The problem is they're the Clantons. They're playing the role of the Clantons in this kind of Western reenactment, and they're gonna go up against the Earps. Which, of course, if you've seen Tombstone or know the history, the Earps win the showdown at the OK Corral. So our crew is like trying to figure out different ways of escaping their fate. It's actually a really cool episode. It has a really nice ending as well, which I won't talk about in case some people still haven't seen it. Go revisit that one, Spectre of the Gun. It also, season 3 also has Day of the Dove, which is a great episode. I really enjoy it, where it's a bottle episode, kind of just takes place on the ship, where a Klingon crew is kind of brought over, and there's this alien entity that kind of feeds off of their emotions. And so it is keeping them in a state of perpetual battle with the crew of the Enterprise, but it takes away their phasers and stuff and gives them like swords so that they can't kill each other faster. But it's really a great, fun episode. And then one of my favorite episodes, I put it in the top 5, is the Enterprise incident. This is a fantastic episode. It's almost like a Mission Impossible meets Star Trek, where, I don't want to give it away in case people haven't seen it, but Kirk apparently goes crazy and orders the Enterprise into not only the Romulan neutral zone, but into Romulan space. And the Enterprise is immediately surrounded by some Romulan ships, which, interestingly enough, are Klingon D7 battlecruisers. So there's, obviously for the show, they just used the Klingon ships rather than the Romulan bird of prey that we'd seen in Balance of Terror. But there was all kinds of, kind of headcanon, and later on it became actual canon that there was a treaty between the Klingons and the Romulans. And so that's why we get to see Klingons using Romulan birds of prey in variants, anyway, in Star Trek 3. And it explained why the Romulans were using D7 battlecruisers in the Enterprise incident. So the entire episode centers around how is Kirk going to get out of this when he has apparently violated Starfleet orders and crossed into the neutral zone and into Romulan space in violation of treaty, and why would he do this? And it's a very good episode. I think it's really, really good. Very, very solid. And good performances all around. It's really great. And one of the other episodes that plays a big role here happens in season 3, and we're gonna need to take a little detour to talk about it. And that's an episode called Plato's Stepchildren. And episode wise, I would say it is not among the better ones, but it kind of goes down because there is a kiss between Captain Kirk and Uhura. And this is 68 or 69 at this time, so of course civil rights movement is in full bore, and there was a lot of anxiety around this episode because they thought it was going to be the first interracial kiss. It is in fact Not even close to the first interracial kiss. I Love Lucy had been on the air since the 50s, and they were considered kind of an interracial couple. There was another show called an episode of Adventures in Paradise. There was a I Spy, Moving with Nancy, but perhaps what they mean is that Plato's Stepchildren figured the first kiss between a white man and a black woman on television. And it was just very, very strange. But NBC was afraid of the kiss because they were worried that some of the TV stations in the South would not air the episode. And in fact, there were some episodes that were kind of banned. Not really banned, but censored overseas. There were several episodes that were overseas that were not shown, but it wasn't because of an interracial kiss. It was because of elements of torture or cruelty or something like that. The BBC did not air one or two of the episodes until well into the 80s, which just seems kind of weird right now, because when we look back on Trek, it's really, really tame compared to, say, today's television. And Nichelle Nichols has a kind of funny story. In an early script, it was supposed to be Spock that was made to kiss Uhura, and Shatner essentially petitioned to have it changed, saying if anyone's going to get to kiss Nichelle, it's going to be me. So I can totally picture William Shatner actually saying that. But it is kind of interesting because it would be some foreshadowing of the Spock and Uhura relationship in the Kelvin timeline of Star Trek, which is JJ Trek, of course. But yeah, so what was interesting about that is that they were told that they had to do these different takes of the kiss, right? And so they had to do a version of the kiss and then a version without the kiss. It was the exact same thing. So Shatner and Nichelle kind of conspired to every version that they were supposed to do without the kiss. They completely messed it up to the point where Shatner had his eyes crossed, all kinds of goofy stuff like that, where the takes were completely unusable. And NBC had essentially the choice to reshoot it or just to use the cuts that they had. So they wound up using the cuts that they had. It is kind of funny. So season 3 comes and goes, and at the end of season 3, they have an episode called Turnabout Intruder, which is an episode where a female scientist kind of swaps bodies with Kirk and tries to take over all kinds of stuff. And William Shatner actually might have won an Emmy for his performance in that episode, but all the TV shows were preempted for President Eisenhower's funeral, and Star Trek missed their Emmy nomination window. So, alas, he was not nominated for that. But that was the 79th of the normal episodes, the 80th if you count the cage. And then Star Trek was done. It was gone. And Fred Freiberger, and I apologize for Freiberger messing up his name. He has a quote here, and it just kind of talks about, and you can see the hints, the beginnings of very adamant fans that feel that they own a property and that you're mistreating it, and they hold a lot of vitriol for that. So he has this to say: I have read that the fans didn't like any of the episodes of the 3rd season. If true, that hurts me. But there is another truth. In my travels throughout the United States, Canada, and Europe, I have run into many Star Trek fans, and not one of them has ever treated me with anything less than courtesy and respect. For that, I thank them. But I have to be honest. I thought the worst experience of my life was when I was shot down over Nazi Germany. A Jewish boy from the Bronx parachuted into the middle of 80 million Nazis. Then I joined Star Trek. I was only in a prison camp for 2 years, but my travail with Star Trek has lasted decades. And that kind of says it all. And we're gonna come back to some of that stuff when we get further into the pre-production for Star Trek II. But for now, we're going to move into... So Star Trek is off television. It is now in syndication. And we're moving into the 70s. And I just need to throw a little note out here. One critical milestone is in January 21st of 1972, New York City was the first Star Trek convention. And it was packed. It had more people than they expected. And that was kind of the beginning. And of course, this is not the first science fiction convention. I mean, Worldcon had been going on before that. There had been other sci-fi conventions and stuff like that. But this was the first one dedicated to Star Trek. There was also something else that was a little bit different about these fans. They started creating their own kind of fan fiction, you know. They weren't waiting for permission. They were just making their own stuff. And so they developed their own fan magazines, which were, called fanzines that had all kinds of stuff like that. And then you actually started to seeing merchandising coming out. And that was kind of new, that you would have these Star Trek bridge play sets and figures and, mugs and stuff with Star Trek. This is way ahead of, now it seems obvious to us, that you would do all this stuff, but this was all very new, back in 1972. So meanwhile, what you've got here is a dedicated audience, and that wasn't lost on Gene. So Gene was actually petitioning for like a motion picture or, a different version of Star Trek, all kinds of stuff, right when the show got canceled. So he was pushing for all this stuff, but you have a dedicated fan base, dedicated audience that's guaranteed. That's really cool. So he kind of gets his wish, sort of, kind of, in 1973. From 1973 to 1974, there was a Star Trek animated series that ran. They had 22 episodes of it, and it came out. It was made by Filmation, and they were responsible for like the Brady Kids and Fat Albert. Actually, it was one of the shows that these guys made, and they had some of the whole original cast came back to do the voices, which was really cool. And then you had some of the original writers, Dorothy Fontana, who you may know as DC Fontana, very critical Star Trek person. David Gerald, great sci-fi writer. Notably wrote The Trouble with the Tribbles. He came back. So a lot of these episodes, and also a fun fact, if you grew up and you watched Land of the Lost, and because you were thinking of, bubble universes and dinosaurs and pylons and the Lost City and everything, you have David Gerald to thank for how messed up you are now. He was one of the creative forces behind that show. But yeah, so these guys all come back to work on the Star Trek, the animated series. And granted, some of these episodes are not the best, because one, the target audience is now, more very much oriented towards Saturday morning cartoon kids audience. These episodes are, I want to say, maybe 22 minutes in length. There's not a whole lot of time to tell stories. There's a lot of Deus Ex Machina resolutions to the episodes. It does kind of finish out the 5-year mission. However, there is like an episode where I think it's called the Counterclock Incident, where it introduces Captain Robert April, who was the original captain of the Enterprise before Pike and before Kirk. And there's an episode called Yesteryear that is all about young Spock. And what's kind of funny and interesting about this is that Paramount doesn't officially acknowledge the animated series in canon at all, except for the episode Yesteryear about young Spock and his Selat, which was kind of like a big bear grizzly bear / sloth Vulcan kind of thing. And this is also kind of funny because a lot of folks, and admittedly, Star Trek the Animated Series especially now is really kind of, it's very dated, and a lot of the episodes are very mediocre, and it does remind you, the animation style is very, if you've seen the Cartoon Network show C-Lab 2021, it looks like that kind of animation. It is not, it is, it's very Johnny Quest kind of animation, that kind of thing. But it actually won an Emmy for Best Series. So it just goes to show how much love there was for Star Trek. And of course, it kept the brand name alive. And it was kind of a lightning rod that you could bring rallying forces, all those fans who are generating their own fanzines and mimeographing them and passing them out by hand, or if you send me a self-addressed stamped envelope, then you get this kind of newsletter-ish, I caught kind of the tail end of that in the 80s, when I was really getting into my Star Trek fandom, where I was getting old enough that I could actually participate instead of just watch the show. And I was starting to go to conventions and stuff like that. There were all kinds of magazines. There was, of course, like Starlog, but in the back you could send, they had addresses, and you could send away for these newsletters, these fanzines, and they contained fiction and artwork, and there was all kinds of clubs. There was like a Starfleet club. There was, it was a lot of fun where you did different missions by writing in your captain's, writing a captain's log of what your ship did, and it was very involved kind of fan fiction. And as a side note to that, some of you may have heard the term when you're talking about story analysis. And so this is not really off topic because QFD is supposed to be a podcast about storytelling. So we still are kind of on topic. There's a term out there called the Mary Sue. And that term actually comes from Star Trek fan fiction. Now that term has become very controversial. And what a Mary Sue is, and it could be, there's male versions, Marty Stew, Larry Stew, stuff like that. And actually the best example I can come up with is a male character. But what it is a wish fulfillment character. It's almost like sometimes it's an author proxy where the author kind of wants to put themselves in the story, but they want to be kind of perfect. And they're kind of like the greatest at every single thing they do, better than everybody else, at everyone else they run into. Now, there is, and I'm just going to jump out to Wikipedia here, and I'm going to read a definition of a Mary Sue. And you guys try to think of somebody that fits this. And keep in mind, this character, now they use a female pronoun in this, because, of course, the article is Mary Sue, not Gary Stew or Larry Stew. But think about who maybe fits this bill. So here's the definition. Mary Sue stories, the adventures of the youngest and smartest ever person to graduate from the academy and ever get a commission at such a tender age, usually characterized by unprecedented skill in everything from art to zoology, including karate and arm wrestling. This character can also be found burrowing her way into the good graces, hearts, minds of one of the big three, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, if not all three at once. She saves the day by her wit and ability, and if we are lucky, has the good grace to die at the end, being grieved by the entire ship. So that is kind of where the term is identified from. It came from a Trekkie's Tale that was written in 1973 by Paula Smith, and it was a pseudo kind of parody story, and it was basically satirizing the unrealistic characters in Star Trek fan fiction. So the story starred a Lieutenant Mary Sue, who was the youngest lieutenant in the fleet, only 15 and a half years old. Now, is this starting to sound familiar? Is this starting to show up? Are you getting hints that maybe I might be talking about a character that not a lot of people love in Star Trek The Next Generation? So, last name of Crusher, and it's not Doctor. So, so Wesley Crusher, at least in his initial appearances, is kind of the textbook Mary Sue. I mean, if you think about it, right? Wesley is clearly a gifted young man, right? They have him on the ship, but the ship is the flagship of the Federation, the Enterprise. And albeit to be on a starship, even in the Next Generation time where they have families and everything like that, it's pretty exclusive posting. And then to be on the flagship of the Federation, it's even more exclusive than that. And Wesley's at the helm a lot of times, right? So, and when something goes down, there's not some adult officer helmsman over his shoulder going, okay, kid, this is a real emergency. Like, get out of the seat. This is my plane. I'm taking it, my stick. That doesn't happen. They leave him there because they're like, oh, well, he's kind of the best guy for the job. He is actually better than some of the best officers in the fleet. And while he doesn't really die at the end, he does just kind of go off with this alien and never to be heard from again. Now, Wesley, I think they, in all fairness to Will Wheaton's portrayal and to the character, I think they kind of fixed that later on, especially when he was trying to get into Starfleet Academy. They had a fantastic episode with Wesley, one of the best, I feel, where he's part of a flight team, and they do this kind of illegal maneuver, and people wind up dying, and they're all lying for one another to cover up the fact that they were doing this illegal maneuver. It is really a fantastic episode, and by that point, through the character growth of the show, Wesley was no longer a Mary Sue. But I mean, I'm pretty sure that when he first shows up, he's 15 and a half years old. It's almost like they were hanging a lantern on the whole Mary Sue thing. But as things always are, when you talk about these things, it gets very polarizing. A lot of people get very offended with the term Mary Sue and identifying characters as Mary Sue. And for a long time, there were not a lot. There were female authors that would not include female characters in their stories. And it was because there was kind of this knee-jerk reaction that if you depicted this competent woman in there, she would get the tag Mary Sue. But when I think about a lot of the characters here, of the female characters I would label with the term Mary Sue, easily only one comes to mind. I mean, I'm sure if I sat there and thought about it for a really long time, I could probably come up with a few more. But in the first Harry Potter book, I would say that Harry kind of, for the majority of the book, really is kind of a Mary Sue character. Everything comes to him very, very easily. He doesn't have to work for everything. People kind of just, oh, you're Harry. Isn't that fantastic? Here's the special thing that you need. Now, by, of course, the end of the movie, when he is not a Mary Sue and he has to show some character growth. But the easy character, I would say, is kind of a Mary Sue, is Rey from the new Star Wars trilogies. And I haven't seen The Last Jedi, so I refrain from speaking of that. But in The Force Awakens, I mean, certainly she can fly the Millennium Falcon better than Han. She can best, having never used a lightsaber before, best a guy, who was trained by Luke Skywalker, all kinds of different things like that. I would say she probably fits the mold. And even if we had just gotten like a minor training montage or had her find a holocron while she was, excavating on Jakku or something that would justify that, oh yeah, she's really gifted because she's been practicing with this holocron, and even though she hasn't used a lightsaber before, she's been practicing with like a stick or a staff or something, so she knows all the moves. And now she's just as lethal as he is. But I really can't think of more characters that are kind of like that. So, but it is just, we went on a big kind of side quest here on the term Mary Sue. Just know that it is kind of a wish fulfillment character, and that term did come from kind of, the Star Trek fan fiction at this time that was being, popularized right now. So that brings us to 1975, 76. Now, there are rumblings in 75 of a second Star Trek, and they were actually trying to bring it to the big screen. They were talking about a feature film, and Gene had been pushing for this all the way back till 1968, when they were talking about canceling the show before the whole letter writing thing. He was talking about moving it into a big budget movie for the time. But a little side note of other things that are going on. So we have OV 101, Orbital Vehicle 101, and it is called the Constitution. Now, we know the OV 101 designation is more commonly referred to as the space shuttle. And the shuttle program is getting off the ground here and everything, and it is called the Constitution, which is kind of funny, and I'll get to that in a second. There is another letter writing campaign in 1976 to rename the OV-101 shuttle Enterprise. And so they do. NASA renames it. They have this whole rolling out ceremony where they roll out the Enterprise. A lot of the original cast showed up. Gene Roddenberry showed up. You can find these pictures on the internet. They're all over the place. It's actually really cool. But it strangely parallels kind of Star Trek nomenclature. And the reason it kind of fits with the nomenclature is that the Enterprise on the show is not its own ship. It's not the only one of its kind. It's a Constitution class starship. And the reason why it's called that is because the first of the Constitution class starships was called the Constitution. So what's cool about that, interesting about it, is that supposedly the USS Constitution starship is NCC 1700, 1700. And NCC, just fun fact, stands for Naval Construction Contract. And don't even ask me why I know that. I just kind of do. So NCC 1701 is the Enterprise, of course. And so the shuttle was not OV-100, which would be fitting for the Constitution. It was OV-101. So kind of has to be the Enterprise. And it's just kind of a funny coincidence that it is the Enterprise. It's just really pretty cool. And another fun fact about this is that the NCC numbers, there were supposed to be originally, I think it was 12 Constitution-class starships. They were the cutting edge. The show played wildly with the NCC registry numbers. They're all over the place. They do not go in order. Some of them don't even have the 17 as the first two numbers. Some of them are different. And some of the reason for that is that Jeffries, who was the model maker and kind of designer, in fact, the Jeffries tubes, if you hear people on The Next Generation, or they go, hey, this guy's going into the Jeffries tubes to conduct maintenance, they're named after him. The reason he settled on 1701 is because certain numbers on the television resolution at the time were too easily confused or mistaken. So that's why it's 1701, because you can tell those numbers very distinctly on TV resolutions of the 60s. So a side fun fact there. But then that brings us up to end of 1976, 1977. Now, starting in 75, there had been rumblings of something that has now taken the name of Star Trek Phase 2. And that was kind of the not really the code name that it was working on under, but that was kind of just the general name that they were giving it. And so they the whole reason behind this is that Paramount had partnered with Hughes, and they wanted to create a new fourth television network. Now, this may sound familiar because they wound up eventually doing it. It just happened to be in the 90s, I think, when UPN actually finally came about. So you can see how long some of these ideas gestate and come to fruition. There's so many things that get in the way. The idea was that they would have a 2-hour premiere on the air of Star Trek launching a new 5-year mission. And keep in mind, at this point, this is a safe bet. There are Star Trek conventions, there's fan fiction, there's merchandising. The show has been in syndication pretty much nonstop since it was canceled. There is a vast Star Trek audience just wanting content. And Gene and Majel and the cast members are going to these Star Trek conventions. And I kind of had this like vague memory of in the early 80s, like packing into a room at a Star Trek convention because they had like a really bad, like a copy of a copy of a copy of this Star Trek blooper reel. And it was maybe only 20 minutes long. But it was kind of funny, and it gave you insight to how the doors didn't open right and everything. And I'm sure if you do a YouTube search nowadays for Star Trek TOS blooper reel, you will see the same version I saw, which is possibly, the same copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. It was very degraded by the time I saw with really bad sound. But we would pack into these hotel ballrooms, and I think you paid like $5 or $10 to see the screening of it or whatever, and just laugh our brains off and just generally have a good time. And Gene was actually doing that for a while. And a lot of the actors kind of fell on hard times. So they were looking forward to a Star Trek Phase 2, with the exception of Leonard Nimoy. And we will talk a little bit more about this in turn. But Nimoy he had written an autobiography called I Am Not Spock, because he was kind of feeling that he was typecast. And when he left, when Star Trek got canceled, he got picked up and was on Mission Impossible. Almost immediately, he had done, if you're old enough, or if you, I guess, stay up late at night enough to watch these old kind of pseudoscience TV shows called In Search Of, I ate that stuff up. And it was all about, ancient aliens and Nazca lines of Peru and Bigfoot and, the Loch Ness Monster, all kinds of stuff like that. And it was a great show. And he did the In Search Of whole series, too. So he had things going on. I think he had a production of Fiddler on the Roof. He had a bunch of other stuff. Shatner and DeForest Kelley, not so much. I mean, Shatner did a couple notoriously bad films. Kingdom of the Spiders is probably one of the best ones. And it's kind of a laugh riot now, but at the time, I mean, it was, so the prospect of having another Star Trek show, very welcome prospect for the original cast. And, like I said, not so much for Leonard Nimoy. And, Gene Roddenberry, has often said that Nimoy did not want to do television at that time. And for his part, Nimoy claimed he had only been offered the pilot and the possibility of a recurring role, so he had no interest in being a part-time Spock. Also, he was kind of still pissed because he did not receive a piece of that Star Trek merchandising money, that, the merch money, which was getting kind of big. So there's some bad blood kind of there and everything, but in a subsequent autobiography called I Am Spock by Leonard Nimoy, he paints a slightly different picture. And this rings true, I'll confess that when I first heard about the new show, I had major reservations. I was still very concerned about being perceived as a one-character actor and still war-weary from the unpleasant struggles from Trek's third season. But I was at least willing to hear what Paramount and Gene Roddenberry had to offer. And here it was, a recurring role wherein Spock appeared in 2 of every 11 episodes, Quite honestly, the offer confused and startled me. Only 2 out of every 11, I was being offered a part-time job. It made little sense for me to be technical, tied up with a series, and having to be unavailable for other challenging work, while at the same time making such a small contribution to the show. I passed. But Star Trek Phase 2 kind of was underway, without Spock on board. Now, we're going to come back to this when we talk about Star Trek 2, because now, this is 1977. So now we're getting into events that will directly affect Star Trek The Wrath of Khan, some decisions and stuff like that. So, and one of the things that came out of this was that the story was that Nimoy was no longer interested in playing the Spock character. And that created a bunch of strife prior to The Wrath of Khan with the Star Trek fans, like some very vitriolic stuff. He actually got hate mail and all kinds of crazy stuff. So that's not a new phenomenon. That's just, you actually, if you were going to hate somebody and send them hate mail back then, you had to actually write a physical letter with a stamp, put it in the mail. You couldn't just fire off an angry tweet. So it's nothing new to fandom, I would say. So when you hear folks go, "Oh, the fandom today is so toxic," it's like, no, this ain't new. There's this, like everything else, there's a small group of very loud people that can make a lot of noise, and they're usually, the minority. But in any case, we're starting to see things that are going to affect Star Trek into its future because of this Star Trek Phase 2. So along with the old characters minus Spock, there were going to be a couple of new characters. Commander William Decker. That starts to sound familiar, doesn't it? Lieutenant Ilea, and a young Vulcan named Zahn, who was going to replace Spock, meant to replace Spock in any cases. So they wind up being recycled, obviously. So the Star Trek Phase 2, if you go on the internet, you can kind of see they did some costume tests. They did some set tests. There were actually sets built for this and stuff. James Cawley, who produces the fan series Star Trek New Voyages, actually got the costumes that would have been used in Phase 2, and he repurposed them for his fan series, the Star Trek New Voyages. So that's actually really cool. And he introduced Zahn on his fan series. So, and used some of the scripts that had been written, because they actually had scripts written for Star Trek Phase 2 already. And these scripts kind of disappeared, except they've resurfaced. Some of them have. So there's a Next Generation episode called The Child. And that's where there's this being of light comes and impregnates Ilea to experience life as a Deltan, right? And the Enterprise hull begins to fail as they come across this strange nebula. Well, that's a Star Trek The Next Generation episode, only instead of Lieutenant Ilea, it's Deanna Troi. And there's another episode called Devil's Due, Next Generation episode. These were Star Trek Phase 2 scripts that were repurposed as Next Generation episodes. Also, a lot of the development that came out of for the Klingons and the Klingon Empire came out of Star Trek Phase 2, specifically a script called K'tumba that introduced a bunch of the Klingon stuff. There was also a very influential novel that came a little bit later, though. It's called The Final Reflection by John Ford. And that came out in, I want to say it actually came out after Star Trek 2, maybe 83, 84. But also laid in all the stuff for the Klingons that you see in the Next Generation. So a combination of that and the Phase 2 stuff. The idea of having a young male Vulcan scientist actually gets morphed a little bit. And the gender of the character is changed, and you get Lieutenant Saavik, who, of course, is in Star Trek II. Now, her character is very different than Zahn, and for being half Romulan, for starts. But we'll talk about that when we get to it. Played by Kirstie Alley in Star Trek II, and then by Robin Curtis in the subsequent films of that trilogy, Star Trek III and Star Trek IV. So a lot of the stuff winds up getting repurposed. William Decker becomes William Riker, Ilia becomes Deanna, and Zahn becomes Data. So a lot of these ideas that were shaped in Star Trek Phase 2 wind up on The Next Generation, but they actually wind up on screen before that. And they come to fruition because the whole TV station thing kind of falls apart, the new network. So Paramount's not going to go with that and everything. So they decide they are going to go ahead and take the 2-hour pilot, which was written by Alan Dean Foster, who is very prolific science fiction writer, wrote all kinds of tie-in fiction and novelizations of films. Like one of my favorite books of his, honestly, is called Splinter of the Mind's Eye. And it is a book that takes place, it is a Star Wars book, one of the initial first Star Wars tie-in book. And the book is significant because it came out in 1978, right after A New Hope, before Empire Strikes Back, and is kind of the first book of the Star Wars expanded universe, which of course is gone now because of Disney Star Wars. So, but Alan Dean Foster had written this 2-hour pilot that was based on a Gene Roddenberry story called For Genesis 2 named Robot's Return. And it was about a starship that crosses the universe looking for its creator on Earth. And it also bore a lot of similarities to a TOS episode called The Changeling that had to do with a space probe called Nomad that is kind of doing the same thing and has kind of become self-aware. The title of the pilot episode was called In Thy Image, and rather than can everything, they're like, well, we're not going to have a new network, so we don't need Star Trek Phase 2. So they essentially cancel Star Trek Phase 2 before it even gets off the ground. But something else happens in 1977, and it's no accident I mentioned Alan Dean Foster and Star Wars. Because Star Wars happens in 1977, and that changes the entire playing field. Because it is a huge hit, as you all know, massive hit, and it sends every studio scrambling for anything they have that resembles in any kind of way science fiction. We also get another film that comes out at about the same time, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which is, kind of a cerebral science fiction alien contact, first contact film. So these two films, Star Wars and Close Encounters, send studios scrambling for stuff. They're like, hey, Alien gets made that way. It's like, hey, what scripts do we have? Hey, here's Alien, which is really kind of a haunted house movie in space, but it works and it's science fiction. It has trappings of science fiction. So we greenlit that, and then they greenlight, Star Trek the motion picture. And about now, I'm going to have to kind of drop off because I am receiving sensor readings of a cloud that is over 82 AUs in diameter, and it is headed directly for Earth. So with that, I'm Mike, and out. You have been listening to Quantum Froth Dispatches by Michael Haspel. Music and other cues are provided by The Fat Rat. The song you're hearing is Monody, featuring Laura Brem. If you would like to support the podcast, please visit www.patreon.com/QFD. Thank you for listening, and we now return you to your mundane reality.